Hi everyone, and welcome to the final session in our discussion series with Professor Paul Weller on his book, Fethullah Gülen's Teaching and Practice. The last chapter is called...
What are we going to do on Monday evenings in future?
No. We're hoping to get you back for the next book, but we're thinking of perhaps a different kind of format, but we'll see if of course it suits with you as well. But yeah, a very sad end to the Monday evenings for the month of December at least, but a lot of people have got Christmas and events to look forward to, so hopefully that'll compensate.
Yeah.
But we're looking at the chapter, and I've got in my notes inheritance, contents, and interactive development, but that isn't the title of the last chapter, is it? Am I?
That's the subtitle of the book.
Yes, inheritance, methodology, integrity, and creativity.
Yes, that's right. Some similarities, but
that's the chapter of the title of this last chapter.
Yeah.
Which touches upon a lot of different themes, and it's quite a long chapter in comparison to the other ones. And it kind of takes us through, I guess. It brings together a lot of concepts that were discussed in the book and tries to tie it together to explain and explore the methodology in more depth, is kind of how I understood. And it brings a lot of kind of questioning of other questions and questioning that both you've contributed to, Paul, and also what members from both Gülen's kind of closer circle, his students, and also members of the movement and volunteers of the movement at large have also kind of raised. So at the very, very beginning of the chapter, there's a discussion on whether Gülen is a theologian, and people have a lot of different opinions, and some people in his Ahmet Korucan, for example, refers to him as one when giving answers to one of your questions. But what is a theologian, and is Gülen one? And then you go on to discuss it in more depth, but just to kind of get the main concepts clear.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know that to some extent the concept of theologian is not one that so generally sits within Islamic tradition anyway. It has a very specific kind of meaning there. I mean, it doesn't also sit very strongly within Jewish tradition. So, but it is there it's within Christian tradition. So, is it a kind of illegitimate use of a terminology to put that on somebody who doesn't come from within that tradition? Now, I mean, I definitely argue Gülen is not what I would call a systematic theologian. So that's the kind of theology in Christian terms that, like Gülen, I think, does start from kind of first principles and sources, but then tries to, systematically, logically work through the implications of that into different fields. I think Gülen is very much more, there's another branch of Christian theology, more contemporary, which is called contextual theology. And that is a theology that is very much concerned with, as the word suggests, the context, and or practical theology, which is concerned with engaging with practice issues and not kind of only theoretical constructs. So in some ways, I mean, I think Gülen echoes something of what contemporary Christians might call contextual or practical theology, more than what systematic theology of a kind that was more traditional and would have been studied in university context, for example, in the West. But I do speak in the chapter of constructive theology, and what I mean by that is that there can be, and I think this not just in Islamic tradition, but it's certainly found there, a kind of a sense that because innovation can be seen as dangerous, repetition of things is safer and is something that perhaps enables a more stable kind of way of thinking and believing and so on. Now, constructive theology is trying to say that actually somebody who practices that is not concerned purely with repetition. And I think, that's an important aspect of how Gülen articulates things, that repetition is not what he's about. Faithfulness to sources, yes, but mere repetition of sources, no. And the constructive theology bit that I talk about in the chapter is about taking the sources, engaging with the context, working out also through a group of people who are trying to put this vision of Islam into practice, and albeit sometimes very slowly and gradually, modifying the constructive theology, the thinking, the expression of stuff in the light of the feedback from that practice. So that's what I'm talking about when I use these terminologies.
I was going to say that in sections, and we might come to this in the discussion, you talk about the role of hermeneutics, you talk about if there's a tajdid going on a kind of renewal of faith, and those I guess are examples of countering the idea of being a kind of repetitive or involved in repetitive theology. There are a couple of sort of thorny issues that pop up, and it was very interesting to read them because I've been involved in kind of similar discussions with people from the movement. But I wondered what your initial reaction. I mean, I'm assuming this is something you were aware of, that Gülen's teachings and practices do change over time.
Yes.
But to kind of say this can be an issue because for some people who are very strict in their understanding.
Yeah.
Be an issue to say, well, if he's a religious leader, how can he change his mind on something? But what was your initial reaction to Kurucan articulating that Gülen's practices and teachings have changed? Or someone from in his inner circle, saying
I think it's very good and very healthy that that's properly recognized. I mean, Gülen himself, in published work, alludes to this. He doesn't, I think, and I can't remember which publication it was in now, just off the top of my head, but he said, we all change, don't we? And I mean, but of course, it's one thing to say that as a generality, and it's another thing to point out where those changes have occurred and what the implications of that might be. And yes, there are other people, and among the interviewees, there are some where one can see they might be prepared to go so far to talk about adaptation, but they don't want to talk about change, because the change thing, I suppose brings into, there's the traditional concern about innovation in Sunni Islam, and secondly, the kind of consistency. Now, I prefer, and that's why the chapter title, let me just remind myself what it is. I've now forgotten it. I talk about inheritance, methodology, integrity, and creativity. So I think there's an inheritance and an integrity which is not about always reaching the same conclusions about things over a period of time. It is about recognizing that within human space and time, one can make mistakes, and one needs, through having encountered more and learned more, to modify. within an integrity. So, and that's where I talk about in the final chapter, and all four of those words are kind of meant to be important for framing the chapter. Inheritance is there, and also there's I mean, in the sense of Gülen working with Islamic inheritance, one could say, but also his own inheritance within the movement. But methodology is trying to point to the fact that what I'm arguing in this last chapter will go forward is not necessarily focused only on the body of his teaching, what he's had to say and so on, but is perhaps more importantly, because if you just took that forward, and especially after he's no longer in this world, what you can end up with is a kind of a frozen deposit, rather than what I think he's concerned with in various ways, which is to work with a living, and the word methodology sounds a little bit cold and clinical, perhaps, over scientific or something, but I think that's actually what he is doing. He's working with a methodology of being Muslim and or being human, because I also argue in the book, in the chapter drawing on the earlier sections, that the hermeneutical key to understanding is, on the one hand, this emphasis on love, and on the other hand, the emphasis on the human. And everything else that's brought forward remains important, but should be read through those hermeneutical keys. And if there's an inheritance from Gülen that's to be taken forward in terms of methodology, but then into creativity, so what's actually done new with all of that into the future, I think if one works with those hermeneutical keys, with love and with the human, then that's an inheritance that has integrity, that works with a methodology that leads to a creativity.
I mean, I was just thinking about the word change itself. I mean, and the kind of Turkish translation for changing something. It's like you've completely changed opinion. It's like from being an Islamist to like you've completely changed.
Yeah.
But maybe, I mean, the term kind of developing is.
Yeah, no, this is, again, it's a very interesting thing, because this is why I talk about also in the next, one of the sections in the book. The second section in the chapter is called Linguistic Deposits, Interpretive Processing and Informed Application. It sounds a bit jargonistic, but what I'm trying to say there is, linguistic deposits are always a problem anyway, because languages don't translate exactly to one another, and what you think you're hearing from one language into another, or even an older version of one language, because Gülen speaks a more classical version in a way of Turkish, and that can raise questions for other modern Turkish speakers about how they understand what he's actually saying, and the whole question of, in terms of a global movement, how one translates this linguistic. So if you just have a linguistic deposit, it doesn't work, because you can't just straightforwardly translate into the discussion in the chapter takes place with the example of Dutch and discussion in the Netherlands about how to translate Gülen's work. But it applies to English or German or Spanish or Chinese, Mandarin or whatever. And yes, it's very interesting, this. And so when people might want to say, well, does Gülen change or not? Yes, that's using the English word change, which can cover a wide spectrum from gradual change to radical change, if you like, without saying which one it is. Yeah,
and I was just thinking in the terms of the importance of linguistics, which is crucial in itself, in translations, etc., also important. But it also made me kind of think of where later in the chapter you talk about the importance of kind of learning through doing, as the key principle in Hizmet itself. So however much you try to tell someone, and it's like anyone, when we get volunteers who come to volunteer at the Dialogue Society and they ask what dialogue is, I can try to tell you, I can explain it for a day, you know, I can spend my 24 hours explaining it, but you're not going to fully grasp the concept of it until you engage in it. It's kind of one of those things that you can't explain really. So,
and the importance about doing and learning by doing is that already builds in to such a methodology of learning. Not only the possibility, but also the probability of making mistakes in doing it. Whereas if you define learning by abstract definitions of what you learn, or whether you accept and properly understand linguistic deposits, for example, that you think, well, you know, I've got it right or I haven't got it right. But learning by doing immediately confronts you with the fact that when you do something, you inevitably, make mistakes. And what's the implication of that? And how do you build that into an ongoing learning process?
I think there's quite a critical question to the movement, I guess, at the moment, because of the situation in which they're in, and people can identify mistakes that have been made in places, but what is the reason behind those mistakes? It opens a lot.
Yes. Now, we did touch it. Actually, I wanted just to say, towards the end of the discussion last week, you asked about were there a variety of voices being self-critical. And actually, when I went back and looked at the chapter after our discussion, I thought, well, there's rather more in that actually than we brought out. So, for example, in a number of the interviewees were quite critical of what they called middle management in Hizmet, which is an interesting terminology in itself. But this was not just Özcan Kelis, this was other Germans and Dutch interviewees and so on, and they were expressing it in these terms, and that partly that's to do with a defensiveness, part of which is understandable, because having been part of the development of a movement which is over many years been, in a sense, under attack in different ways to post 216. One doesn't want to kind of, the danger of washing one's dirty linen in public, so to speak, is that one gives ammunition to people who have been attacking in a way that is not about self-criticism, but is a way about destroying. How do you do that? And of course, some people, I think, therefore have this strong sense that, well, the problem about self-criticism is that it provides this ammunition to others. But I think certainly in the European voices, broadly speaking, among interviewees, there was this saying, well, we need to have more of this self-criticism. And it wasn't just an isolated voice saying that.
And I think, as well as giving ammunition, but also, I mean, I think a lot of people, the primary concern is whether it will harm anyone back.
Yes. Well, of course, yeah, absolutely. And that's also in a context where, where people's life and liberty has also come under threat. That's, again, understandable. But the question is, at least one thing I would say about Hizmet in general is that any movement that has debate in it is not dead. So if if something that was once a movement stops having debate,
Mhm.
that debate. This on the web. Oh, sorry, my iPhone speaking to me. I don't know quite why, but I found this on the web. But anyway, debate is a sign of a living thing.
Mhm.
The stopping of debate is a sign of something that's run out of steam or is shutting down. Yeah.
On the topic of debate, then I'll go to a topic that is frequently debated within the movement. I mean, less frequently now than what it was when it was a larger issue. But Kurucan touches upon the idea that Gülen's understanding of women, perhaps their place in Islam and understanding of women within Islamic society changes. Does he touch upon that in any more detail? I mean, I think in the chapter, it's just accepts that I think it's like in 1977, his idea isn't the same as what it is today. I mean, does he give any more kind of specific?
He does, but I'm now trying to remember whether it's in this book or in the other, because sometimes some aspects are filled out across the books. And in the European book, there's a chapter on various challenges around Hizmet in Europe, and one of those is specifically around women. So it might have come out more actually in that chapter than in specifically the Gülen teaching practice book. But I mean, as I recall it, I mean, he talked about an early period, for example, when although the development of the schools allowed opportunity to young women, when women would visit, for example, there would be, a reticence and a holding back of a cultural kind. And that also, I think Kurucan talked about actually some of the early visits of Gülen to Europe and specifically to the Netherlands, I think, cited, that started a series of questions, I think, for him, having seen things differently in the same way also that the kind of practice of religious freedom for Muslims in Western societies also started a series of questions that was different from the inherited position within a predominant monocultural kind of mono society, and also in that sense a patriarchal society. So those things are taken up, and but Gülen himself, I think, not too much more addressing of that question so directly in the sense that I got from my research, but within the movement, definitely so. And again, within the European book, quite a number of the interviewees talking about this. So the contrast, for example, between, I think, of the interviews in Switzerland talked about, well, historically we had our groups and they were all called the Flowering Lotus or something like that, women and flowers and whatnot. And now it's different. So it's not, I mean, obviously that's kind of in one way superficial change. It's about image, but that was there. And in the Netherlands also strongly the argument of, and also that touched with the question about working with others and about uniqueness or normativity or sharing with others, which comes up in this chapter, that engagement among Hizmet women with other women in women's movements has actually been a motor for change and development. Now, how far, and again, because Gülen is not a systematic theologian, I wouldn't necessarily expect him to kind of write a whole book on or do a whole series of sermons on women now kind of thing. So in a way, one only has snippets. Now, does that mean, very significant changes taken place, or the change has only been very small, or it's a question.
I mean, I asked it because I had remembered one of Gülen's very early writings that I had read, and I've just checked the date as well. It's in 1988 that it was published, and it refers to women as diamonds. And then, of course, diamond is something that therefore needs to be protected. It's sacred, precious, but also needs to be protected. And I can kind of understand where he would come from in his sort of cultural context of, someone who was born and raised in a sort of village environment, and the role of kind of women in that context and society. But towards the end of the article, in the very last paragraph, there's quite a kind of subtle attack on feminists who, within the Middle East and Islamic context, had done things, and it's not example by example listed here, but things like forced unveilings or kind of ulterior motives within a colonial context of what feminists were doing in the Middle East at the time. So I guess he's got an awareness of that, but it's like it's a very kind of subtle text that says, women are precious, they do have rights and etc. But at the end of the day, whatever this feminism isn't something that's good. It's kind of where the text is going to. And I can understand the context and why. I mean, for me, it's totally understandable that Gülen would write this in 1988, and then his opinion today would be different. But within the movement, that distinction isn't quite made, and people who preach on kind of several levels, whether they're elder Abis or Ablas, for example, would take this and then give a lecture on this text rather than the changes in practice at the moment. So it's
I mean, again, we come back a bit to linguistics, because the word feminism is kind of highly charged in different ways for different people, and it's as if it comes with a set of baggage or assumptions of what lie behind that. In the same way, I think that different kinds of political terminology. Well, in a sense, feminism is a political term. It's a socio-cultural political movement. But yes, there is an assumption for among many of those who don't work comfortably with the terminology of feminism, that feminism entails a whole set of stuff that it doesn't necessarily entail for all feminists. It might entail that for some, but not for others. And so this is part of the difficulty, I think. It's similar to, I think we discussed a little bit earlier about the relationship between, in the socio-political context, between people who might be more left-wing and might be associated with, or in Turkish history, with Marxism, etc., and the Marxists are all atheists. Well, no, they're not. But this is kind of these associations that go with things. And I think feminism is a kind of a... And there are many parallels to that. One can see, it's not just an Islam Muslim world phenomenon. You can see those similar debates in the Christian world also.
I mean, just we on the term feminism as being kind of like a term which is kind of highly charged. I remember when I was studying politics first year, I read a book on Anarchy, and I thought it was amazing.
Yes.
Because I mean, there's a deep intellectual effort behind the theory. It's not just everyone's wild. I mean, structures of power play a role, and how who controls what, it plays a role, and it was very fascinating for me. But then I remember reading a text by Gülen who just shuns the idea of anarchy altogether.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm sure if he read this book, he'd like this book, because it's not saying anything bad. I mean, the kind of current world in which we live in, which is structured in countries and with nations, we're talking about 100 odd years of history and relative history in the world in which we're living in. But it was interesting to, I mean, I think the concept of anarchy from an Islamic perspective, and again, it's the importance of linguistics, is this world where there is no order in a kind of faith-based sense, that things in Islamic you call fitna, but I don't know what you'd call it in English really, but that's loose and it can cause harm to the majority of society.
Yeah.
That's not what anarchists
No,
are assuming and then writing about. So that was
well,
interesting.
this goes back again to some of the earlier things we touched on. I think in the period of severe civil strife, civil war, in effect, in Turkey, left and right on the streets, as Gülen put it, everybody killing each other. But there one can understand why, in that context, in his writings, he would speak of what you might call a preference for order over disorder. And of course, many people then go further to read that, well, was that support for a military government? Well, no, I don't think it was, in the sense that I think it's in this classical sense, that classical Islamic sense, that order is preferable to disorder. But as you say, anarchists, when they're talking about anarchy, are not talking about everybody just do anything. They're talking precisely sometimes about the kind of critique about the power structures and games and injustice that goes on, that's built into the way societies operate, and that needs to be dismantled. And yeah, as you say, I think there are things that would be very sympathetic to that in other aspects, but Gülen doesn't frame it, of course, in terms of the terminology of anarchy. And certainly also in relation to what we've just been talking about, the terminology of feminism is not a terminology that's worked with by him, I think.
Yeah, and I think, but the fact that it isn't worked by Gülen, I mean, I guess he isn't the spokesperson for individual minds within the movement, but
no, exactly,
it prevents some sort of discussion. We'll come later to the issue of capitalism, and it's an example of a lot of things that we've been talking about in terms of injustices in society. Because then if someone, and there are individuals who use the term feminist to describe themselves within Hizmet, but then they'll have people critique them because of the article in that text, which was written in 1988.
Yeah.
So that's contentious, I guess. But the people are saying the same thing. It's just they're getting locked down on kind of titles and frameworks in which they're presenting their ideas. But we'll come to that a little bit later. So Tekelan says that there is no Gülenism. But I was wondering if you thought there were any kind of dimensions or constants within Gülen's teaching that could identify perhaps a kind of strain of thought. I mean, you say he isn't a modernist or a liberal thinker, and that he works within the classical teachings, but I mean, we can talk of a kind of a Ghazali inspired set of rules, or someone who works within that train of thought, for example, and that would be a sort of ism within a subsection, I guess, itself. I don't know if it's right to say that, though. I mean, to some extent, I'm kind of against it, because Gülen's work, in my opinion, is consistently about renewal. I mean, every Ramadan, he'll read the Quran with a set of students, and he'll read several tafsirs. And even if it's one word within one verse of the Quran that he makes a different commentary on, there is always a constant change, in my opinion. But maybe it's the methodology which is in the ism itself. I don't know. But the ism is something that's used by states and also people from the movement when describing the Hizmet movement, and also when kind of used as an identity marker in the asylum process. So I wonder if that's perhaps, is there a Gülenism in kind of the religion sort of discipline and not in another role? Is it different?
Yes. I mean, this goes to one of the things about how labeling takes place internally and externally, and how far one lives with what's given externally or doesn't. I mean, the Christian tradition from which I come, for example, is called Baptist. The original Baptists didn't call themselves Baptists. They just thought they were Christians trying to recover aspects of the early Christian tradition and live faithfully as Christians. Other people called them Baptists because they had this practice of baptizing not babies, but people on profession of faith. And then the word Baptist in Europe, continental Europe in particular, became associated with the terminology Anabaptist. And although actually many of the Anabaptists are highly peaceful people, like Quakers, the Anabaptists of Munster were famous for basically creating a theocracy in the city of Munster, and it all went terribly wrong, and ended in violence, and so Baptists had to kind of live in a way, had this label given on them, but today they call themselves that. So there is a dynamic that goes on that's quite difficult, because external people give a label, and how far do you continually protest against that and say no, it isn't that, or how far do you use it but then say, but please understand, it's not quite like that. Now, as far as an ism is concerned, and Gülen, in terms of teaching, I don't think there is a Gülenism. And that's why I argue in this closing chapter, part of how it all comes together, I'm saying what there is a methodology of working. But that's not an ism. It's not like a scientifically articulated logical body of thought, which ism tends to imply. Mm-hmm. Where there's something closer to it, I think, is in the dynamics of how certainly numbers of people, particularly older generations, but not only within the movement, would seem to relate to the person of Fethullah Gülen. So it's not, in my view, an ideological ism, Gülenism, but one might say that the kind of the gratefulness for a receiving an interpretation of Islam that has made sense to people and opened up their lives, then gets translated or turned into a form of respect and indeed love for Gülen, but in a way that then becomes over personalized. And so, and this is discussed in the last chapter here about also about what the implications are when that person is no longer there, and whether actually this over personalization might take place even more post Gülen's end of this earthly life, in the same way that kind of Nursi became, a kind of highly venerated figure, in a sense more so after his life. So I think Gülenism as ideology, as body of thought, is a terminology that, although I know people use it, is something I think, isn't very useful. It doesn't accurately reflect, and it isn't very useful. It's more, I think, when it's used, it's more of a, anyway, it's used by state authorities or those who support the state, and it's linked with the idea of kind of cultic political mafioso type movement idea. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that's expressed in terms of a kind of unhealthy cultic thing around and I think there's more to that one isn't careful than there is to the ism in the other sense.
And I mean, you touched on it as well. I was going to bring the discussion to the question of whether Gülen is a holy figure or not, or a sacred figure or not. It's how some people refer to him.
Yes.
I guess I'm in the younger generation who doesn't see him as such, but you mentioned, people in older generations see him as kind of a sacred figure.
And it's not just older, actually. I think in the chapter there are a number of voices about this. So I think it's one of the anonymous voices, but it is a relatively younger person who says, well, if I don't actually get to visit him regularly, I feel there's something really missing. Now, in that, I think one gets to see this kind of sense that I'm alluding to, I guess. Whereas other people, other voices in the chapter, particularly I think from within the Netherlands, were almost more pragmatic and saying, well, look, I'm very grateful for all I've encountered, learned, read, heard about. but this is not the center of my Islam. This is not the center of my even being associated with Hizmet. So there is a spectrum here, I think, and it isn't just age. Though I think the age thing, or the age stroke cultural thing, obviously there are certain ways of expressing respect that are culturally embedded and are age related. Many younger people don't have those ways. It doesn't mean that they're disrespectful, however, but it means that they have a different way of.
It reminded me of someone, I think, who is in his 50s. I know he wrote a poem for Gülen, and it was kind of published. I mean, that way of articulating one's affection for someone isn't. I mean, it's a very sort of Middle Eastern discourse, but it's not something that someone in the West would do. So I guess it's that kind of cultural difference as well.
Yeah.
But I guess it also makes me think about what I understand and kind of think about as holy. So I guess holy or sacred is something that's so precious that you can't touch or engage with. And I guess that's kind of like a difference. I mean, when the person who says that quote and then compares Gülen as possibly, not being holy at the moment, but if he passes, like, he become such a figure. I mean, I don't see Nursi himself either being particularly sacred or holy. Perhaps I mean, his books are valued and the people read them and debate them and try to adapt them, but it's not holy or sacred in a sense that I don't think would follow for Gülen either. I guess it's how that affection is kind of articulated changes, perhaps age and generation and culture. But I don't think it's sacred in the sense that, I mean, maybe my understanding of sacred.
Yeah, it's an interesting, and again, there's something perhaps to be thought about from kind of comparative religion in this. Again, things are very different, but I mean, within Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, there's this tradition of the saints. So they would be people who would be, and the word that they would use in Catholic tradition very clearly to make sure that it's not going over the top is they would talk about veneration of the saints. There's a quite distinct line there between veneration and worship, if you like, which of course in Islam would be completely beyond bounds, but veneration and the idea of the saint as holy, but that is recognized through a process in the Catholic tradition over time. But often individual people have a warmth of kind of veneration for a saint or for somebody who's come to be seen as a saint. And of course, they're not just historic figures in the Catholic tradition. They do, there are the Vatican makes, so to speak, or recognizes recognizes some contemporaries. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, for example, is in a process of being recognized in that way. And then people have that set of feelings towards that person. I mean, either if they're still living, but more often they're not in the Catholic tradition. So after they've passed, those feelings. So, whether there's something of that, I think,
Yeah, I definitely think comparative with other religions is probably a good way of understanding it, because in Islamic tradition, within Sunni tradition specifically, you wouldn't have a shrine in your own home, for example, if it was a saint. I mean, you'd perhaps value their work, include them in prayers or read prayers that they read, but not.
Of course, there are plenty of shrines for Sufi saints.
But again, they wouldn't be kind of taken into individual homes. I mean, you wouldn't have. In that sense, it's different. I mean, you go to perhaps a short.
You would go to
spiritual. Yeah. There's a kind of spiritual journey within.
Yes.
Talking about other scholars, and I'll go into the Sufi saints and things now. Kurucan mentions that he conducts a interview with a journalist, Ayub Can, regarding, and then they come up with three different the three different types of Gülen. One is Gülen, who's kind of like an Imam Ghazali, who has students and teachers, and he's a different person with them. Then there's a different Gülen when he's engaging in large audiences, in sermons perhaps, and that Gülen is Gülen from a Rumi kind of perspective. And then there is the Gülen, which is Nizam al-Mulk, which is the founder of kind of madrasa systems, and that's as a problem solver. And then I don't know if that was your comment later on, or him saying that, this creates a problem because people...
He was saying something,
people then misunderstand Gülen. I mean, are they identities which I don't find them to contrast or conflict with one another?
Personally, I don't either. I think, but I can kind of understand where the connection might be made in one context, but not in but this is again why in the book I've also been very keen. So lots of people think of who are not at the movement, if they think of Gülen at all, they think of him in relation to, if you like, founder of school movements and whatnot. So that's one aspect, but and you could kind of sociologically and historically evaluate that, but you miss so much if you didn't understand the Ghazali part of him, so to speak. But I don't find it no, not at all incompatible. I mean, I think different contexts, different audiences mean that people engage with things differently. I think he does. I think we all do that in different ways. So I'm kind of chatting to you here about a book in a way that in another kind of audience I might treat it differently.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking if he's in a more sort of Rumi identity when giving a sermon, he could talk about problem solving, or he could, preach very specific things as if he was teaching. So I think they could perhaps overlap as well. I mean, I can see the three different kind of strains within larger character, but I don't know if they're that distinct and kind of come out at different places. I mean, I guess if it was a very large, distinctive kind of two different figures, someone who's perhaps more of a kind of charismatic leader when giving sermons, and then someone who's I don't know, very strict in his teachings when teaching students.
Yes.
That would give a leaning towards those who view Gülen as, or the Hizmet movement as, a cult, and brainwashing the masses. And then
that's right. Well, the voice inside is different from the voice outside, and all of that.
But I mean, I think it's something that Gülen has those identities, and they may come out at different.
So I mean, I remember a few years ago, and I think my talk is somewhere on YouTube still. Felix Meleitus in the Netherlands, there was a conference on the movement, and I think I remember trying to help people more broadly outside the movement understand, for example, again we come back to language, that when Gülen is talking to those who are kind of close enough within Islam, and he may well talk quite differently, in the same way that, in for example, a Christian preacher in a service of worship will use language that they wouldn't use perhaps in a lecture hall, because the context is different, and that other people know roughly what you're meaning when you use a set of words that make sense to insiders. But that when outsiders hear those, they can be highly misunderstood. I can't just right now think of an example off the top of my head, but I mean, this is the kind of thing I think that there could be. It's quite natural, but it is the case then that sometimes, discourses and dialogues that are internal can be quite badly misunderstood, because the frame of reference is different, the starting point is different.
We do just have 6 minutes left. So I'll
6 minutes after 6 weeks.
6 weeks. I just think I got 2 points. Can I link them?
Yeah.
I'll try and link them. So one of the points is that there is a kind of lack of transparency with the movement. Some countries are trying different modes to overcome that. But there is a kind of not lack of, but a differing kind of styles of critique and different modes of it within the movement, and to some extent it doesn't go far enough with certain issues, and how people react to it and also engage in criticism is different. But then you say, you know, that the movement allows external observers to come in and study, and you talk as yourself of one of those people. And that being something that perhaps others can learn from with regards to his
work. No, I do, and I very genuinely mean this. That I mean, having quite a bit to do with various kinds of religious movements. Not all are as ready to, in principle, give the freedom to other people to study and critique. What if I have a critique? It's about. It's not so much that sometimes the movement doesn't self-critique enough. It's that those of us who are not in the movement don't always use the freedom we're given, perhaps, to be as, in the proper sense of the word, sharply critical as we might be. So that's one of the ironies, that actually, in a sense, when you're treated as a guest, in a way, in a proper honouring sense of a guest, and given access, of course you don't want to abuse that. If you're much more at a distance, you might speak more sharply than so it's a kind of strange phenomenon, really, in a way, that in a way the very receptivity of Hizmet to, in principle at least, people from outside commenting on, critiquing, observing, analysing, is itself something that can almost soften what might come otherwise.
I was just going to link that to perhaps, is there room, I mean, is the criticism that the movement can perhaps face constructive in any chance? I mean, you mentioned the work of Max Farrer, I think, in relation to capitalism, his article Anatolia Muslimhood, Humanizing Capitalism, which was published in Open Democracy. And I'll just kind of quote what he says, and then we can discuss it. So he says, in my view, the movement is what it says it is. And then continues, yet another effort by spiritual people to humanize a monster, and the monster in this case is capitalism. It's probably the best organized and most coherent effort yet, but just with all the world's religions, this movement seems unable fully to confront the massive injustices and inequalities that capitalism engenders. I mean, it's a very, I think, valid but big critique. I mean, how is a movement one amongst billions of other individuals living on the planet going to confront something such as capitalism itself? But it is the critique.
No, Max Farrer's critique I'm personally also quite sympathetic to, because earlier in the chapter I actually quote a kind of set of observation, positive things that I, in 2006, early days of engagement with the movement, just prior to, in the context of a Turkey visit, and other things. And I kind of said, well, also this attempt to be a kind of a third way, and third ways which often in a world that's divided, if you like, between a kind of socialist vision and a capitalist vision, end up falling between two stools. So yes, and I think we touched in an earlier discussion, and if not, certainly in the European book, where I try to work out in the European context how these kind of inheritances, ultimately from Nersi as well, about education and unity, disunity, dialogue, and relief of poverty, but I point out that it's much more rare that one finds within the movement a critique of what I would call structural poverty, as distinct from the poverty experienced by individuals, which can be individually helped. Where does that come from? What lies behind it? And is that something that either individuals within the movement might articulate or not?
I think I know the answer.
In interesting reflections on a kind of a potential liberation theology in the closing chapter. Or is there also, might there be particular initiatives that could be developed that would be more concerned with the structural roots of poverty and not just the individual manifestations of it?
I think that, again, I wanted to touch upon the liberation theory Balger comments on later on, but we're kind of up on time. But just the last question, I do think the answer lies really within the Turkish origins of the movement being very scared to critique the state at any point.
Yeah.
And coming to critique capitalism, I think for a lot of people is a wary territory where they'll be worried they'll say the wrong thing. And I mean, the history of capitalism in Turkey itself is very recent, 80s onwards, kind of.
Yes.
And 40 odd years of it, experience itself. But I think because of
this neoliberal version, then
and
I think what I'd say about that is that part of the problem for all who live in a predominantly capitalist world, that's most of the world now, because even those who go by a different label are often operating according to state capitalism, China, for example, now, is that it's thought to be the natural way of things, that the way things are structurally is natural. And what I'd say is, I think, I would hope, I think within all the prophetic religions, there is a root of a critique that says this amount of suffering, this amount of injustice, this amount of poverty, this discrepancy between rich and poor that exists in our world cannot be the natural way of things. There must be, at the very least, open to a prophetic criticism. How one goes beyond that, and again, we come back to words. Is feminism, a word? Is capitalism? Is socialism? What do these words then engender? But I think putting it this way round, the present order of our world and how it is and how it affects the majority of people in our world is not something we should accept as natural.
And when you went back to language, I think, the critique of capitalism would be leftist in a Turkish mind, or a Hizmet mind is very radical atheist, so they'd steer away from that idea altogether. A nice place to leave the discussion. Hopefully we can come back to the discussions with the second book in the next year. But I hope you have a very nice December and have a nice Christmas, New Year's, and get to have some time off and rest.
We're heading back to the UK on Saturday for a few weeks. So.
Brilliant. Take care.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
I've enjoyed it a lot. I've been taking my notes as we've been discussing each week.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.